We begin our story in the foggy days of prehistory, when the land was wild, when forests of moss-dripped trees covered the continent, when dinosaurs roamed through the badlands of Alberta. This is prehistoric Canada, a period which covers everything before the arrival of Celine Dion. Canada, BC, before Celine. It was lush and it was dark. And it was wild. The only intruders were the giant glaciers which would periodically crawl out of the Arctic and cover the land. The ice advanced as far south as Sudbury. At Sudbury, the ice turned around and went back to the Arctic for more rocks. The glaciers advanced and receded like the tides for years, making Canada one of the first countries with automatic defrosting. As they crept out of the Arctic, these huge flux of ice ground down everything in their path, driving all the inhabitants south. Today, this feature of Canadian life is provided by Revenue Canada. The first white explorer to reach the New World came from a world of ice, Eric the Red. Other Scandinavians trying to sail across the Atlantic had failed, but Eric the Red was a Norse of a different color. Young students sometimes ask how it was that Eric the Red landed in Canada. Well, with a name like that, he had a fat chance of landing in the United States. Thanks to the description that Eric took home, nobody else tried to discover Canada for several hundred years. Eventually, the Europeans did return to the New World. Intrigued by colorful travel brochures and lured by a favorable rate of exchange, they forsook the beaches of the Mediterranean and arrived by the boatload. They came during the summer for the annual fishing festivals held off the east coast of Newfoundland. Of course, they didn't know they were in Newfoundland. They thought they were in Bombay. When they realized where they were, the cruise business dried up. The fishermen were replaced by explorers who sailed west looking for the east. They were like dogs chasing their tails. What they discovered was a vast continent already settled by the great Indian nations. The further west they went, the more the great Neolithic tribes they met. The Huron, the Algonquin, the Iroquois, and the Socreds. The first French explorer to sail up the St. Lawrence was Jacques Cartier, later immortalized in the Quebec national anthem, Frere Jacques. Cartier ascended the St. Lawrence as far as the Indian village of Hochelaga. There, he stood on the summit of Mount Royal and was told stories of a rich territory just up the river where treasures were abundant for the taking. This proved to be a lie. Ottawa wouldn't be founded for years. Other famous French explorers were the cartographer Samuel de Champlain, the father of New France, who in the summer of 1605 helped build a habitation at Port Royal. Champlain organized the Ordre de Bon Temps, the first social club in North America, known in English as Hockey Night in Canada. Many of the explorers who opened up the new territories went on to open car dealerships. There was LaSalle, DeSoto, and Cadillac. Ville-Marie, known as Montreal, was founded by Paul de Chaumédy de Maisonneuve, or Queen Elizabeth as he's known in English. Maisonneuve's settlement immediately drew the fear and hatred of the Iroquois, the Algonquin, and of Toronto, which was just about to be discovered. These early voyageurs, or voyageurs as they were known in English, found the New World rich in fish and wood and furs. They presented themselves to the Indians as emissaries of foreign kings, but the natives saw them for what they were, pale and sickly men who had no skills to live off the land. They couldn't even survive a winter without help. Not only that, these know-nothings, as they were known in French, were prepared to trade woven fabrics and metal goods that were unavailable locally at any price for the skins of a few animals that could be found in abundance by anyone who wanted them. They actually preferred used furs because they were softer. It was as if aliens had arrived from outer space, offering unimagined technological delights in exchange for a few old clothes. Eventually, the French fur traders paddling upriver met English fur traders paddling downriver. The result was that the French Enough! The result was that the French began a campaign of pillaging British forts. Where there was no fort for the French to pillage, the British built one. This went on for more years than anyone cares to remember, owing to the long distances the armies had to march to meet defeat. Until finally, the British and the French agreed to meet on the Plains of Abraham to decide once and for all who owned the continent. The British troops were led by General James Wolfe, who had been carefully trained in the British military art of losing every battle but the last one. The French were led by Lieutenant General Louis-Joseph the Marquis de Montcalm, or as he was known in English, Celine Dion. After midnight on September the 13th, the British troops floated past the citadel of Quebec on rubber inner tubes, fooling a sentinel who assumed they were just whitewater rafting. After much argument, they had agreed to rendezvous in a rocky cove. A cove they chose because it coincidentally bore the same name as General Wolfe. When Montcalm awoke the next morning and saw the British troops doing their morning stretches on the Plains of Abraham, he decided upon the only course of action that would ensure his defeat. He left the safety of the fort to fight. During the battle, Montcalm was shot. After conferring with his staff, he decided the wisest course of action was to die. When he was told that he had won the battle and would be expected to winter over in Canada, General Wolfe immediately decided to die himself. After the defeat of the French, whenever that was, the 13 British colonies to the south realized that without France to worry about, they no longer needed Britain's protection. Meanwhile, to the south, a group of prominent colonists signed the Declaration of Independence. When someone noticed Canada was closer than Mother England and the going drier underfoot, the colonial army attacked. Unfairly, hitting below the border wherever possible. The British were obliged to advance backwards until the fleet arrived. When the fleet did arrive, Governor Carleton was able to chase the Americans back across the border. Carleton, however, was unimpressed with the lackadaisical support he received from British North Americans, so after the war, he went home to England in a huff, which was the favorite means of transportation of British governors at the time. According to the Treaty of Paris, both sides in the war agreed a border would be drawn between the two countries so that no matter where a train or bus crossed it, immigration officers would be able to wake passengers up in the middle of the night. After the Americans had won their revolution, those people in the colonies who had bet on George III had a choice of being shot or moved to the Canadian Maritimes. Some of the braver families, known as the Loyalists, chose the Maritimes. What with the French and the English and the Indians and the Loyalists, things became confusing along the banks of the St. Lawrence. For this reason, the British government sent Carleton back to Canada, having taken the precaution of changing his name to Lord Dorchester. Under Lord Dorchester, Canada was divided into two parts: Lower Canada and Upper Canada. This was the beginnings of Canadian politics. When he realized what he had started, Lord Dorchester huffed home to England once more. To forestall any more appointments to Canada, he died. The War of 1812 began when the Americans noticed on the evening news that Britain was busy fighting Napoleon. The European War gave the Americans an idea. Canada's only successful military strategy seemed to be the arrival of the British fleet. It was obvious. Britain's preoccupation with Napoleon made it a good time to liberate Canada again. A few Canadians and Indians under General Brock chose to fight for continued tyranny. This ragtag bunch, who were known as the Brock Busters, went on after the war to establish a successful chain of video stores. Before the Americans could rally, the War of 1812 had been held over to 1813. For the Americans, 1813 was one of the worst years of the War of 1812, though not as bad as 1814, which is when they tried to surprise the Canadians at the beaver dams. Laura Secord, who knew the beavers personally, swam 20 miles upstream and warned the Canadian forces. Secord went on to form a chain of video stores herself, which failed because she stuck to the beta format. The war was ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. And at this point in Canadian history, everything stopped for the opening of the West. The coastal people of the Northwest were like no others in North America. They lived in a world of mountains and rivers, islands and inlets, colossal cedars and lush rainforests. In the summer, fat salmon swam up the mountain rivers in such numbers that early explorers like James Cook and George Vancouver reported that they could walk across the rivers on the salmon's backs. Of course, after they'd spent a few weeks on the West Coast, they also reported they could fly, listen to music for hours without moving, and eat a family-sized bag of Doritos in one sitting. Meanwhile, the interior of the young country was being mapped by Scotsmen working for the Hudson's Bay Company. One of the Scots was Alexander Mackenzie, who was the first European to reach the Pacific by land. Another was Simon Fraser, who discovered a large river that he thought was the Columbia, but by coincidence turned out to be the Fraser. western plains that these men were traveling across offered spectacular vistas of blue skies and prairie grasses waving in the wind. And of course, great herds of bison. Large, shaggy creatures with shoulder humps and manes of hair around their head and neck. The Europeans were so taken by the bison that they immediately set about to exterminate them, killing over 50 million during the 1800s, often by driving entire herds over cliffs known as buffalo jumps. When there were no more bison left to slaughter, the Hudson's Bay Company didn't know what to do with their Saturday afternoons. They missed the bellowing herds kicking and plunging into carnage, but they were soon able to recapture the excitement for their store customers. Since that time, whenever that was, the bison hunt has largely been replaced by Bay Days. It was at this time that another creature with a shoulder hump and a shaggy mane of hair arose out of the Canadian wilderness. He was soon identified as Sir John A. Macdonald. Macdonald was a politician of great natural charm, which was especially strong when he exhaled. It was Sir John who led the push towards a confederation of the Canadian and Maritime provinces. To celebrate the union of British North America, the Fathers of Confederation had their picture taken. The date of this historic occasion was July the 1st, 1867, which is the only date in Canadian history, except for the end of the War of 1812, which was 1814. Having become more charming than ever, Macdonald went to London and helped the Queen choose a name for the newborn country, settling on Canada because that's what it was already called. They also chose the motto, Amare usque ad mare, which roughly translated means, I'll have a little water with the whiskey, please. In the next election, the Canadian population went over to the Mackenzies. Alexander Mackenzie introduced the Temperance Act, and that made Macdonald so mad he joined up with a new party called Canada Thirst. He was poured back into office. The railway was finished at last, and on a date that went down in Canadian history and never came up again, the last spike was driven at Craigalackie, British Columbia. Saskatchewan, which hadn't had its rebellion yet, was resentful and broke out in hostilities. The Métis sent to the United States for Louis Riel, who had been hanged several years previously. But due to a strict training program and plenty of road work, Riel was making a dramatic comeback. After being hanged, Riel had been elected to Parliament, but was disqualified on the grounds that being deceased, he was only eligible for the Senate. This left Riel bitter towards the government, and he seized the opportunity to lead a rebel force. He was, however, caught again and hanged at Regina. This time it took, and he never ran for public office again. A few years later, Sir John A. Macdonald died, drawing favorable notices from all parts of the empire. The Conservatives fell into the hands of men who lacked his vision and couldn't hold their charm. Canada thus went Liberal under Sir Wilfrid Laurier, owner of the popular Ottawa Chateau. Canada's been more or less Liberal ever since, except for 6 years under John Diefenbaker, 6 minutes under Joe Clark, and 6 centuries under Brian Mulroney. 6 years into the new century, Canada turned to the Tories again. The country is still strong.